Hello again. Let's take a look this time at the history of the WARS franchise's roots in the WARS TCG, or trading card game from Decipher Inc. The roots of the trading card game actually go back even further than 2004 when the series premiered. You see, from 1995 through 2001, Decipher was producing the Star Wars customizable card game, or CCG, one of the most beloved Star Wars-based card games ever to be produced by any of the Star Wars licensees. The game mechanics were very solid, and they slowly grew as the game expanded through numerous expansion sets based on the classic trilogy films, the first prequel film, The Phantom Menace, and even some expanded universe characters and situations, to become something much grander in scale, much more complex, however, than it was when it was originally launched. Now, this was both a good thing and a bad thing. It was a bad thing because sometimes it made it hard for new fans to get into the game without a lot of help from seasoned players. On the other hand, those seasoned players really got into it and enjoyed the complexity of the game based around those great core mechanics. They liked to see the game continue expanding. I myself was a player of the original Star Wars CCG way back when, and I can't even tell you how much money I spent on the thing by the time all was said and done. It was a great game. Well, when the license left Decipher in 2001, it sort of left a void out there of that type of good, solid core game mechanic that Star Wars fans were looking for. They wanted to play something like what they've been playing since 1995. They didn't necessarily want to jump to another card game, this time from Wizards of the Coast, that played so very differently. WARS stepped in to fill that gap. It's the spiritual successor to the Star Wars CCG. It's known as the WARS Trading Card Game, or TCG, and at times was known as things as WARS the Mumon Rift, WARS the Mumon Rip. There were a lot of different title variations that it went through before it finally hit store shelves. But hit store shelves it did, and that was in October of 2004, with its first 330 or so card set entitled Incursion. Now, let's take a look before we look at the individual expansion sets or individual sets. Let's take a look at what I mean by the spiritual successor to the Star Wars CCG. This is one of the few Star Wars CCG cards that I happen to have left as I try to center it here. Was it Mara Jade, the Emperor's Hand? One of the first with Shannon Baxa, now Shannon McRandall, as Mara Jade, one of the first EU cards from that series. You had your Destiny number up in the corner, you had your title across the top. Most notably, you had the lore partway into the down the card. The lore was something that made this series very unique because it added to the Star Wars expanded universe. The gameplay mechanics are down at the bottom, power and such in the middle, and a great image. In most of the cases of the Star Wars CCG, the images were taken from the films or something doctored around the films, not necessarily a direct screenshot from the films. Now, if you take a look at a card like this one, we can then place it alongside, let's say, Jylen Wrath, or Wraith. I don't think I've ever heard it pronounced out loud. He's going to be in my story, though, so we'll decide. You notice here that the cards are laid out somewhat similarly. You've got the lore, you've got the Destiny number up in the corner, you got statistics down the middle, you've got the game mechanics way down at the bottom. It's very much laid out in a similar fashion, although it somewhat has refined the game mechanics from the original Star Wars game to make for an easier-to-use card set for the WARS TCG. You know, in the span of almost 10 years, they had a chance to refine the gameplay. In fact, whereas the Star Wars game by its end had core rules plus numerous supplements for the rules, you could play WARS in either of its incarnations fairly easily. You simply had an Incursion rulebook, very small, little tiny thing, kind of like the old Star Wars one, and then eventually a slightly updated but not very different rulebook for Nowhere to Hide. You could play the game with really either one and still really get a lot of enjoyment out of it. It didn't take a lot of time to change things because the game mechanics had been refined using the Star Wars CCG for so long that not a lot needed to be refined. Imagine, for those of you who are Star Wars CCG fans, taking the game that you sort of grew up with and boiling it back down to the best game mechanics that it had in its entire run. That's what WARS did. It was the next step in the evolution of those game mechanics. And again, played really, really well. I've had a chance to play it quite a bit recently myself.